The wind was hot and dry, creeping through the minuscule seams in Hawkeye's uniform and brushing across his bare face. Underneath him, the rust-colored earth was warm, and his rifle was the temperature of his body, where he had been holding it for so long. It was peaceful. Time crawled, his breathing slowed, and there was that certain stillness that he craved even more these days, when he felt like he wasn't alone in his own head. It was the part of his job that he excelled at. Hawkeye didn't feel happy often, but in moments like these, when he was so in his element, he thought he got close. Until Tempest forced him to remember that she was there. She sat up from where she had been prone next to him, pulling her helmet off and dumping half her canteen over her head before pouring some in her mouth. He repressed the annoyed sigh as much as possible, but Tempest heard it anyway. "Shut up," she told him, settling herself back into position and picking the spotting scope back up. "I feel like I'm suffocating out here." He didn't say anything. He rarely did. But he imagined throwing his spotter off the cliff they were posted on. Not for just her loud mouth, but for a myriad of other reasons. Tempest had it in her head that she knew the truth about the sniper, and even if he was skeptical, Hawkeye knew she was too close for comfort. Assigning her as his spotter was probably Sentinel's idea, to help smooth out whatever tension was obvious between them. But the commander had no idea of the depth of things. Regardless, they were professionals. They would get through this assignment. Hawkeye focused on the horizon, watching for anything out of place while Tempest looked at the sky. "There," Tempest said quietly. "See that? Looks like a dust storm." He just grunted. They were back at the Superstition Mountains, outside of Flatiron City, one of 3 sets of snipers posted to provide security for the excavation team at the mine. Before deployment, Sentinel had told him that another of the spider creatures had crawled out of the cliffside a few days after excavation began and mauled an Umbral engineer to death before it was dispatched. After that, Umbral had second thoughts about using normal security on the site that Ares had previously cleared, and assigned Eclipse Initiative members to the job instead. Of course, they hadn't seen a damn thing yet. Just the excavation team scurrying around like ants, and now, an approaching dust storm. Tempest sat up again and tapped her fingers on her wrist interface for a few moments. "Well, it looks like it might miss us. Should we call it in anyway?" "No." She huffed and laid back down, and Hawkeye felt the satisfaction of annoying her. The wind picked up a bit, and he adjusted his grip on his rifle, the leather glove on his left hand creaking. Like Tempest said, the dust storm rolled in, but only caught them on the edge of it. Both of them pulled their helmets back on, and he could hear the grains of sand hitting his visor. Hawkeye's vision was obscured, but not yet bad enough to switch to thermals. Then, as quickly as it came, it was gone, leaving a hazy orange fog hanging over the desert. The sound of wind disappeared, and Tempest shifted next to him. That was weird," she muttered, her voice muffled through the helmet before she pulled it off to wipe the grit away. The world was silent, and he realized his heartbeat was the loudest thing around him. Hawkeye sat up slowly, taking in the landscape. Something was wrong. He could still see the mine and the excavation team working, but it was all silent. Nothing moved except the haze in the air. "Hawkeye," Tempest said suddenly, her tone serious. Adjust your scope. Up and to the right. Acknowledging the command, Hawkeye smoothly dialed in his optics, aligning his sight with Tempest's directives. What's the visual? Movement, 12 o'clock, high. Tempest replied, tone measured. Unidentified figure closing in on the mine. Hawkeye's focus intensified as he peered through the glass, his breath controlled. Confirmed, he responded. One unknown, advancing rapidly. The sniper watched the figure moving through the heat-distorted air. It was humanoid in shape, but the details were obscured by the shimmer of the heat. The movements were swift and sure, but not like a soldier's. The way it moved was unusual and sent a chill up Hawkeye's spine. It was dark, featureless at a distance, and out of place. Tempest remained silent for once, her fingers hovering over the button to contact base. Hawkeye adjusted his breathing, and his scope settled on the figure. His crosshairs lined up perfectly, and the reticle blinked green. His finger hovered over the trigger. He could feel the pressure on the guard, and the slight give of the trigger. He exhaled. Engaging target. Understood, his spotter replied, looking through her scope. His finger pressed the trigger. A sharp crack split the silence, and the figure stumbled. Hit, Tempest confirmed, already adjusting her scope to follow the target's movement. Still advancing, the figure continued, undeterred. Another round, Hawkeye breathed. Wait, Tempest cut him off. It's changing. Hawkeye saw the thing, its form becoming distorted and strange, the limbs growing longer, and the mass splitting. Contact, he said, and Tempest activated communications.
Inbound,
Tempest relayed into the comm.
We've got something incoming on the ground, at the dig site. What is it?
The comm crackled, one of the other sniper teams coming through.
Unknown. Some kind of... I don't know. It's splitting apart. Repeat, we have an unknown hostile on the ground. Copy that, Team Mary's B.
Another sniper team chimed in. Neither of them took their eyes off the creature, watching it writhe and twist. But then it stopped, turning its misshapen body towards them, and between one breath and the next, everything around them shifted. It was as if someone had turned the saturation dial on the world all the way to 0. All colors bled from the world, except the creature. It was the only thing Hawkeye could see. He raised his eye from his scope, blinking to clear his vision. But when he opened his eyes again, they were somewhere else. It felt like chaos, like a shaking of the very cells of his body. Hawkeye's vision was dark, and deep within his gray matter he heard a familiar, Russian-accented voice tell him, "None of this is real." "Tempest, do you copy?" he shouted, reaching blindly to the side. It had been so long since he had raised his voice that it cracked with the strain. "Tempest!" "I'm here," she called, and he turned his head to see the dim outline of her body, barely visible in the darkness. He reached out. Whatever animosity he felt towards the girl was forgotten in the shock of it all, and when he made contact, there was light again. But they weren't in the Superstition Mountains anymore, and the mine was nowhere in sight. Hawkeye looked around, his eyes straining to take in the strange landscape. Everything was in shades of red, as if all the light was coming from far below, and the ground under his feet was black rock, with small white veins running through it. "What the fuck is this?" Tempest whispered, and the sniper felt her fingers tighten on his arm. "Where are we?" "I don't know," he said, low and rough. She must have felt his anxiety because she squeezed his arm tighter. We're not dead, right? Not dead. Hawkeye shook his head, and she let out a shuddering breath. His hand was still clenched around his rifle, which brought him a sense of relief, however small. He wasn't used to relying on anyone but himself, and being without his weapon would have left him completely exposed. Okay, she said. We have to get out of here. Figure out where we are and call for extraction. Let's activate our distress beacons. Hawkeye did so, hitting the command on his interface while he looked around. There were no landmarks, no features on the strange dark world. It was a void, a place that made no sense, and he felt a prickle of panic start to work its way up his throat. He didn't answer Tempest. He didn't need to. She was just comforting herself, giving herself something to do besides admitting that they were well and truly screwed. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then he opened them. The world was still the same, but he was in control again. He was a soldier, a fighter, and he would not give in to fear. He would do what he had always done and find a way. He scanned the horizon, and then he saw it. In the distance, a point of light. There, he pointed. Let's go. They walked across the strange surface, their footsteps making a dull, thudding sound. Towards the pinprick of light, towards the only feature in the bare world they had been forced into. Sentinel had been restless all morning. He wasn't used to having entire days without anything to do, so he bled out some of the uncomfortable energy by going on a long run. It helped center him, but the feeling didn't fully dissipate. It all made sense when he made it back to his apartment and saw the two Umbral agents posted outside. Major, the one on the right said, we have a problem. He was the second to arrive in the briefing room. Aegis had apparently been the easiest to find, since she spent her downtime working in the clinic. Jester and Raptor arrived next, still in their workout clothes and smelling of sweat. What's going on? Jester asked. The agents had explained the problem to Sentinel as they escorted him to the briefing room. Hawkeye and Tempest are MIA. We're being deployed to track them down. You've got 30 minutes to get your gear and meet me in the hangar. There was a beat of silence before Jester said, I think we might need a little more information, boss. Yeah, Raptor chimed in. Agreed. Sentinel could sense the annoyance rolling off of him. The co-commander was in the dark, and it gave Sentinel a tiny twinge of satisfaction. Umbral had sought him out first. Sentinel shook his head. Their post was compromised. They were ambushed by some kind of enemy. As far as we know, it was a single unit, but they're saying it was strong. Hawkeye and Tempest have both disappeared, and we have no idea what happened. The rest of the site is on lockdown until the situation is resolved. Jesus. Jester whispered, while the rest of the team digested the news. Aegis was silent. Sentinel spared the medic a glance and noticed she had gone so pale that he could see the vasculature beneath her skin. He waited for her to speak, but she said nothing. I'll brief you in full when we're airborne, he finally said. You've got 30 minutes. They all muttered in agreement and exited the room one by one until it was just Sentinel and Aegis left. 25 minutes now, Corporal. She swallowed once, and then a second time, crossing her arms. They weren't on good terms, he and the medic, and it took a significant amount of patience not to either press her for whatever was bothering her, or just walk away. Finally, she spoke. Can we pretend for 1 minute that where the people we were before the Genesis operation. Sentinel ground his teeth together. No. 2 of your teammates are MIA, and you're wasting my time. She seemed frustrated, but wasn't finished. Tell me the truth then, at least. Do you think Hawkeye might have what? Getting her to say the words was like squeezing blood from a stone. Sentinel, what if Hawkeye did something to Tempest? We have no reason to believe that, and no time to talk about it now, he told her stiffly. They are 2 of the highest-ranking Eclipse Initiative members, just like the rest of us. They'd never jeopardize one another, or the mission, over some personal grudge. But get your gear. Be in the hangar in 20 minutes, he told her. That's an order. Aegis looked like she was going to argue, but then she shook her head, and the mask slipped back into place. Yes, sir. They all made it on time. Jester with his hair still wet from the post-gym shower. Sentinel had a matte black case with him, separate from his weapon loadout, and once they were all loaded into the chopper, he set it at his feet. While the pilot performed his final checks, Sentinel told the team what he could. Before they disappeared, Tempest called in an unknown entity on site, and everyone heard Hawkeye discharge a shot. The other 2 Eclipse sniper teams zeroed in on where this entity should have been, but there was nothing there. But one of the other spotters did pick up the bullet trail, so Hawkeye did fire at something. Afterwards, they tried to contact the 2 of them multiple times and failed. After calling for the site to be locked down, the other 2 teams went to where they were posted and, while it was clear they had been present recently, they were gone. Raptor was quickly scrolling through the screen on his wrist interface as Sentinel spoke. He had sent Raptor the information files he had been given, and the other man was rushing to get himself up to speed. It says here there is noted the smell of rot near Hawkeye's post. Sentinel nodded. Yes, but there were no footprints leading away, and no sign of a struggle. Raptor frowned and turned his interface off, crossing his arms and leaning back against the metal wall of the chopper. Okay, so, our 2 main suspects are obviously the arachnid creatures, and the intruder that was in our midst. But if there is no sign of a struggle, we can eliminate the arachnids. Yes, Sentinel agreed. No, thank God, Jester muttered. Raptor nodded once, which leaves us with the intruder. Umbro recovered what little of it was left, correct? There was next to nothing, and by the time they got it back to base, it was nothing but dust. Sentinel was highly disturbed by this turn of events, and wasn't thrilled about having to report it to the team. They deserved to know, but he knew that its infiltration of their unit had disturbed them to the core. After Sentinel had shot the intruder, it had looked like any other dead biological creature for the first few minutes. But by the time they began to head for extraction, it had already started to rapidly decompose. During his briefing, Sentinel had been told that it had completely degraded down to dust by the time they had gotten back to base, and that the Umbral scientists were furious that something so valuable had slipped through their fingers. To make sure that there were no more of the creatures interfering with the mining and excavation crews, they were forced to check in via a video feed every 2 hours. Each crew leader was equipped with psionic inhibiting headgear as a backup precaution. And while there hadn't been any other incidents regarding the intruder, Sentinel had the impression that Umbral wasn't relieved by this, but disappointed. Who knows what they could gain from a creature like that? Raptor's mouth thinned. Dust, huh? Not great. He paused, thinking. We're in agreement then, that it's almost likely something like the intruder interfering with Hawkeye and Tempest? Yeah, It makes the most sense, Aegis added. Do the other teams on the ground know about this? The bare minimum, Sentinel confirmed. Neither the other two sniper teams nor the excavation teams have any idea just how seamlessly it managed to infiltrate our ranks. It doesn't help that we don't know what its intentions were. But don't lock yourself into this theory either. Something else entirely could have happened to them. And that is why we have this. He leaned down and picked up the box at his feet, opening it to reveal what was inside. A spire device. The same sort they had to retrieve on the Crescent Springs mission. It was smaller and more compact, black and thin silver wiring running across the outside, and a small green light slowly blinking. Since none of us are trained to use it, Umbral had it programmed to constantly emit a passive field of psionic interference. You remember that Dr. Eldridge was able to cause hallucinations with the Spire prototype, and whatever the intruder was doing to us was similar enough that this should protect us. This Spire doesn't have any offensive capabilities, so even if it were taken off us, it won't cause any harm. But I was told to warn you that if you start to experience any headaches or breaks in reality, to tell me right away. Jester leaned forward. How did you manage to get us the prototype? Umbral was pretty eager to have it in our possession after the incident. They're very invested in the idea that these intruders have biologically evolved to use psionic powers, and that the Spire devices are a way to counteract them. He closed the case and sat up straighter, looking each of them in the eyes. Now, are you ready to get the rest of our team back? There was a chorus of affirmatives, and Sentinel felt a rush of pride. Good. Let's go. The light grew larger and brighter the closer they came, but with each step, things around them slowly morphed. The dark, empty place they had been thrown into was something liminal, and as time passed they moved from the purgatory and into a rainforest that looked all too familiar. And through the trees, the spot of light they had been following slowly became a facsimile of the sun. Because it had to be a facsimile, right? There was no way in hell they were back in the forest surrounding Viridian Labs. Hawkeye, Tempest whispered, just loud enough to be heard through the convincingly accurate sounds of the forest around them. You see this too, right? The sniper kept his rifle shouldered, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Yeah, but there's no point in standing around. We've got a target, so let's keep moving. She didn't agree, so she said nothing. It was shockingly close to what she remembered. The air heavy, wet, and smelling of decomposing underbrush. Tempest thought they should stop and take stock of the situation, where they were, and exactly how real it was. Because if they weren't in Viridian, then they were just walking endlessly to nowhere. They needed to break the illusion, not continue to exist within it. The path beneath their feet was narrow, and the thick underbrush was so close that she was brushing against it every few steps. At first, she didn't notice the shadows gathering like dark pools at the base of each tree, spreading out thick black tendrils that seemed to be reaching for them. But when it finally caught her attention, she felt a surge of uneasiness. She wasn't a child. She had seen the darkness of the forest many times, but the feeling of being watched had her skin crawling. She was about to mention the shadows when something grazed against her side. She jerked away from the sensation and turned to see a branch hanging limp, its leaves fluttering slightly. Tempest turned back around, her heart pounding, and found that the darkness had spread and the trees were much closer. Her steps stuttered, but Hawkeye didn't stop. The message was clear. Keep moving. Shadows continued to move, silently rushing through the trees and coalescing into something that grew bigger by the second. At first, the darkness was on both sides of them, but when they had grown to the point the entire underbrush was nearly black, the shadows spilled forward and into the path. Both of them stopped in their tracks, forced to, when the shadows combined and grew. The blackness rose from the ground, slithering through the air as it formed first 2 legs. A torso followed, then 2 arms, and finally, a disturbingly long head. The entire thing was featureless, rough, and crackling at the edges like television static. It was tall, taller than both of them, and as it sparked and crackled, she got the oddest impression that it was 2-dimensional. It towered above them, and Tempest could hear the roar of her heartbeat in her ears. Hawkeye fired. 3 shots hit its chest and it barely stumbled, its head shifting slowly from side to side as though it were listening. Hawkeye's breathing was shallow, and the 2 of them began to back up. The creature took a step forward, its arm reaching for them. Tempest threw herself backward, hitting the ground hard. She rolled, coming up into a crouch, and Hawkeye was firing again. The bullets tore through it harmlessly, embedding themselves in the trees beyond. The sniper was smart enough to know that wasting ammo was pointless, but Tempest didn't blame him. What else was there to do? When the shadow spoke, it felt like it was speaking directly in her mind.
Enough. Thieves, killers. Submit and I will make this as painless as possible.
Hawkeye stopped, and Tempest froze as well. The shadow's voice was harsh and seemed to grate across her consciousness. "What do you mean, thieves?" the sniper demanded. The creature ignored him, raising its hand and clenching its fist. They were slammed backward and into the trees, Hawkeye's helmet coming loose and bouncing across the ground. Tempest felt the impact in her spine, the breath leaving her lungs. While she tried to catch her breath, it continued to speak into her head, the silent voice like sandpaper in her skull.
Is this place familiar to you? This is where you stole our most precious thing, our mind breaker, our healer. And now you will lead me back to it.
Tempest slid down the tree, sucking in heavy breaths as she tried to focus in on the shadow. It hurt her to look at it, burning in the back of her eyes. It was so impossibly dark, like it absorbed the light around it. If she narrowed her eyes, she could almost see something inside of it, something skeletal and looming. But the static and blackness was so damn thick. Absorbing what the thing was saying wasn't easy, but when she was finally able to swallow the words down, Tempest tried to make sense of it. What had they taken from Viridian? The alien, the one that had melted all those humans into that mountain of flesh. Is that what this was all about? She couldn't find her voice, and her head was throbbing, but Hawkeye had the same idea. "We don't have it. We're just soldiers."
Liar!
The shadow hissed, the sound tearing through her head.
You have what is ours. You are one part of an entire whole, a little bee I will follow back to the hive.
Tempest didn't feel herself moving, but all of a sudden the shadow was closer than before, way closer, and she could feel cold rolling off of it, and then crawling into her nostrils, the smell of rotting meat. That thing in Flatiron City, Tempest put the pieces together in her mind. That was you.
Yes and no. It was my puppet, and it failed me. But the two of you can take me where I need to go, can't you? I will ride inside your mind like a parasite, and you will carry me in, none the wiser.
It was a stupid question, all things considered, but she couldn't stop herself. Who are you? Tempest asked the shadow. Its features, if they were features, didn't shift, but it brought its hand close, and for a moment she thought it would touch her face. It told her, without words, who it was, what it was. She saw a ship, silver and glorious, cutting through the emptiness of space. Through the eyes of the shadow, she saw its crewmates, and the writhing creature they kept in the glass box. It showed her things she didn't understand, things she didn't comprehend, and things that made her stomach turn. And through it all, she felt the pain of betrayal, the desire for retribution. The shadow drew away from Tempest, turning slightly toward Hawkeye, as it forced the same images on him as well. But after a moment, it hissed and pulled back.
Your mind is too crowded. The smaller one will have to do.
It turned its head back towards Tempest and reached out, so very cold against its cheeks. The touch didn't feel like a hand, more like a frigid breeze, and it helped her snap out of her stupor. It's just a projection, she called, and felt a rush of triumph as Hawkeye replied. Close your eyes. Tempest screwed her eyes shut as she heard the tiny click of the flashbang pin being pulled, the sound of it hitting the leaf litter, and then the thunderous percussive boom as it exploded. It had barely ended when Hawkeye barked at her. Move now! Run! Tempest was up and sprinting before she was even fully on her feet, slipping in between trees as she forced her legs to move as fast as possible. Her ears were ringing and her vision overly bright. She knew Hawkeye was in front of her, and from the crunch of leaves and brush, he was moving just as fast. It wasn't more than 10 seconds before he darted to the side and rolled behind a fallen tree, Tempest right on his heels. After they caught their breath, the sniper panted. It's fucking with our heads. We have to find the physical body. And how the hell are we supposed to do that? He didn't answer her, checking over his rifle in silence. It made her grit her teeth and reminded her who exactly it was she was trapped in this hellscape with. She was split. Part of her thought he would be content to leave her to die, while the other part was certain that his allegiance to the team as a whole made him more willing to work together. How far would she go to help Hawkeye? Tempest wasn't an idiot. 2 Ares agents were always going to be better than 1. And she had no desire to see what kind of trouble she would have with Umbral if she left one of their assets to rot in some hallucinated jungle. If anything happened to Hawkeye, Umbral would use it as an excuse to look closer at her, and she wouldn't be surprised if they took steps to control or neutralize her if they had any hint of her little excursion with Aegis. God, she hated the way she had to think. It would be a lot easier to concentrate on nothing but her own best interest. Tempest focused her anger outward and gave the sniper her own evaluation. She didn't like Hawkeye. He was manipulative, closed off, and willing to do almost anything as long as it got the job done. Within the team, it didn't make him obviously dangerous to work with, but she had her own conspiracies about the sniper. Her mind moved briefly back, and paused on the memory of the man she had come through the Eclipse ranks with, Cypher, his death, and much later, his voice falling from Hawkeye's lips. It was too tangled of a knot for the moment, so she let it pass. For the time being, she needed to focus on surviving, and that meant finding the source of the shadowy projections. Since Hawkeye didn't seem keen on elaborating, she took the reins. "Did you see the same memory? Or whatever that it showed me? The one with the ship?" He nodded once. "Yeah, same one from the Viridian hangar. Came with Chimera." It confirmed what she had been thinking, and it made her shiver. They owned it, from what it looked like. Tempest didn't bother voicing why that scared her so damned much. It had to be obvious. The Chimera organism they had faced had been so terrifying all on its own that the idea of it being subservient to some other being was insane. But she could hear the fallen leaves crunching under her boots and feel the rough bark under her palm. To create an illusion like that was a daunting show of power. What exactly were they facing? "Do you have a plan?" she asked, her tone just a shade sarcastic. "Yes." She waited, but he didn't say anything else. After a long moment, she sighed. "Well, are you going to tell me, or is this some kind of figure-it-out test?" He ignored her, of course, and asked his own question instead. "You have a med pack?" "Yes." "Cautery pen?" "Yes." "If we can't take it out, then we need to shock ourselves out of the hallucination. Pain should do it, or at least it's worth a try." She frowned. "Shock ourselves? Do you have any idea how crazy that sounds? It's either that, or we wander around until it catches us," he snapped. "And since I'd rather not see if that thing can actually live in our heads, we're doing this." Anger flared in her. "You don't have to worry about that though, do you? It said your head is too crowded. Now what the hell does that even mean, Hawkeye?" His eyes shuddered. "Focus. Make the burn, and then we don't know how long that will give us clarity. Go for the kill. If that's not possible, get as much distance as you can." "Fine. You lead, I'll follow. And if you get hit, I'm leaving you." "Noted." They each had a small med pack with them, complete with a handheld cautery pen. It wasn't the first time Tempest had used it, and she didn't hesitate to dig it out and press the red button. The blue fire ignited, and she watched the heat warp the air. Hawkeye repeated the same process, and they sat there in the hollowed-out tree, both mentally preparing themselves for what they had to do. "Fingers have the most nerve endings," Tempest said, pulling her right glove off with her teeth. "Do the pinky. Shouldn't interfere with shooting." "Right." They had no time, no more planning, and no more words. Both of them pressed the flames to the tips of their fingers, and Tempest swallowed the scream that built in her throat. Unlike her youth, adult Tempest was no stranger to pain, and she had been burned before. It had been an accident, her own fault, clumsy from years without the knowledge of hurt and freshly full of drugs that had turned those pain neurons on for the first time in her life. She remembered the smell of her own charred skin vividly. It had been a bad burn, the kind that required extensive treatment. But this was different. It was pinpoint, concentrated agony, and her vision immediately swam. It was so bright, and her eyes were watering, and her heart was pounding, and she was still fighting off that scream. To her amazement, Hawkeye was silent too, as he burned a hole in his flesh. She was still immune to so much compared to a normal person. Level 10 pain would only rank level 3 with her, and it was definitely an all-time high for Tempest, and Hawkeye's stoicness staggered her. The flames cut out, and Tempest gasped, her mouth gaping open and closed as the misery radiated out from the wound. She could still feel it, and the stench was nauseating. Her ears were ringing, but her vision cleared as hot desert wind swept over her face. They'd done it, but she could already feel something pressing in on the corners of her consciousness, a change trying to force itself in. Tempest whipped her head left and right, taking in the scrub brush and rust-red mountains in the near distance, and sucked in a deep breath. She didn't see the shadow anywhere, which meant there was only one choice. Tempest ran. It felt like deja vu for ages, landing back in Flatiron, but it was masked by her concern for the situation. The area was still beautiful in a parched, haunting way, but now it was covered in the skeletal scaffolding and framework that Umbral had created. The mine and the city were now just assets to be sucked dry. They were met by the senior Eclipse Initiative officer on site, a member of one of the other two sniper teams with the codename Spectre. He showed them to the area where Hawkeye and Tempest had vanished before returning to his post, leaving the four of them alone. Sentinel had the Spire device hooked onto his belt and active, and Aegis swore she could feel it buzzing on the edge of her awareness. There were no signs of either agent, and no traces of a fight. No blood, no scorch marks, no debris. She expected the command to spread out, but Sentinel kept them together, wanting to make sure that they were all under the umbrella of the Spire. Combing the area was slow going, the sand of the Sonoran Desert fluttering in the wind and obscuring footprints in a matter of minutes. There was an odd sense of something in the air, something that felt wrong, almost oily on her skin. It made her want to pick at her uniform, pull it away from her body just to feel some air, but she didn't. They were losing daylight, and there was no way in hell she wanted to be hiking out there once darkness fell. Sentinel took point, while Raptor continuously scanned the area with a thermal setting on his visor. Aegis was just behind him, and Jester brought up the rear. They had mapped out a search grid, and were covering the area square by square in near silence. Everyone was focused intently on finding the other two team members. Too bad they had no idea what they were looking for. It was a few hours in when Raptor suddenly said, "Got something, northwest." Sentinel veered off their current trajectory, following the coordinates Raptor was giving. As they grew closer, the shape became clearer, and the dread settled deeper into Aegis's stomach. The blackened corpse was still smoking slightly, and the scent of it reached her a moment later. She had smelled enough burnt bodies in her day that it barely fazed her. But she saw the way Sentinel's shoulders stiffened, and the way Raptor shifted his grip on his rifle. It was a body, sure, and humanoid in shape, but there was something off about it that tugged at her primal fears, mismatched proportions beneath the charred flesh. It looked like the intruder that had walked among them, but rougher, like half-formed clay. "Weapons ready," Sentinel ordered. "Keep your eyes peeled, and don't get separated." Jester tapped his temple. "Still no answer via comms. Visual contact is preferable." Aegis could feel the unease radiating from the others. This was the same thing they had faced before, and it was clear the memories were still fresh in their minds. Then Raptor said, "Look around." At first it wasn't obvious, because the body at their feet was fresh, black and striking against the pale sand. But as she looked more closely, she could see the lumps scattered around them, partially buried by the shifting sand. First 2, then 5, and at her last count 11 bodies. Ares investigated each of them, and each time found the same thing: a human-shaped creature, dead and disfigured, abandoned in the dunes. Some of them were almost bone by that point. At Sentinel's command, Aegis knelt down next to one and brushed the detritus away from its face with her gloved hand, looking for a cause of death. Like the first body, this one too had been burned. Aegis stood, brushing her hands off on her pants, when the first attack happened. Raptor had gone further out, and his shout rang through the quiet desert. His weapon opened up, firing round after round. Instantly, the 3 of them were moving, sprinting toward him as the rounds exploded and echoed across the wasteland. But by the time they had gotten to him, the shots had stopped. Raptor was standing, panting, his gun pointed out, and the dust still swirling around him. There wasn't time to ask questions. More of the creatures were pouring out of the landscape around them, some of them digging themselves up from the sand, while others seemed to just appear out of thin air. Aegis remembered her hallucination caused by the spire back at Crescent Springs, and her chest felt tight. But there was no time for that. She raised her rifle and got to work. At a distance, the creatures looked like soldiers, completely human as they sprinted towards the group. It made her head hurt. When they were outside of the spire's passive field, they warped her perception. But as soon as they crossed the invisible barrier, it was clear that they were monsters. Tall, with that oddly long head, 2 long limbs, clawed hands, the sinew-red skin. The bullets tore through them, and their screams were horrible. The first line dropped, and Aegis and her team moved forward, pushing the creatures back and continuing to fire. But the horde was relentless. For every creature they killed, another came to take its place. She was used to fighting, and it wasn't the first time they were outnumbered. But the fear that crept along her spine was different, and it made her shots just a bit wider, a little less precise. Where the hell were they all coming from? Jester figured it out first.
Damn it! They're reanimating. Full-scale destruction, then, Sentinel called.
It never struck her as odd how many of their missions came down to cleansing, all-consuming fire. The basis of humanity, and the thing that seemed to always pull them out of a bind when they were facing the otherworldly.
Blow it. Destroy all the bodies, the commander continued. On my mark. Aegis, take the left. Raptor, right. Jester, center.
All around her, they opened up, the machine gun bursts reverberating and thunderous, even to her. The desert around them exploded, organic tissue spattering, bodies disintegrating from the force of gunfire. They worked with such precision, only diverging their lines as the bodies drew closer. It felt like it could go on forever, their position isolated in a field of gore. It went on so long that she could also feel her adrenaline running dry and the shake in her arms getting more pronounced, not that she would ever admit it. When the bodies had been destroyed, to the point it took them several seconds to reassemble, Jester took over. He was armed with the same M320 grenade launcher as before, but this time it was loaded with custom incendiary rounds. Aegis could hear Jester calling his target locations as he aimed, could hear his yell of affirmation to Sentinel, could see the explosions racking the dunes and igniting bodies that had been halfway submerged. The flames engulfed the land, a moving wall of death, consuming and chewing on the carrion. All around them, the fire devoured. Some of the creatures made it to within a few meters of them before dropping, their hideous faces contorted and mouths stretched in screams that couldn't be heard over the explosions. For several minutes, they mowed down the unending waves, a symphony of bloodshed. Finally, Sentinel called for them to break the pattern and wait. Her arms were trembling with adrenaline, and the spent muscles and the hot gun barrel burned in a way that both familiar and oddly was comforting. It was a feeling that meant she had survived once again, that Ares had triumphed. As she looked over their handiwork, a prickling between her shoulder blades told her something was wrong.
"Raptor, at your 5,
Aegis called. One of the creatures was shambling towards Raptor, half of its arm and torso destroyed from one of their grenades. It was badly burned and missing most of its leg. The limb severed with thick, flapping pieces of muscle hanging down like wet ribbons. And yet, it was still moving, still determined. Its jaw snapped open before Raptor could finish it off, and a broken voice, as thick as smoke, poured out.
"This is not the victory you think it is."
With that, it collapsed, shattering against the sand like glass and starting to disintegrate within seconds. Around them, all the other dead creatures were doing the same, just like the intruder they had killed their first time in Flatiron City. "What the hell was that?" Jester asked, watching the creature that had spoken turn to ash and nothingness. "It was a message from whatever was controlling them," Raptor said grimly. "These are puppets, thralls, which means whatever was controlling them is probably what took Hawkeye and Tempest. This isn't going to be easy." Sentinel gestured and started walking into the drifting smoke. Aegis sighed before holstering her guns. Jester clapped her on the shoulder briefly, and she pushed aside her worries for the mission, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other. The flames were slowly dwindling. The dark smears from the bodies on the dunes were all that remained. Aegis poured an electrolyte package into her canteen and drank it, while Sentinel and Raptor discussed their next moves. At first, she was content to sit with Jester on one of the large rocks that dotted the landscape, listening to him swing his own praises. But as the minutes passed, she found herself looking at the spire device on Sentinel's belt, a vague, cloudy idea forming into something concrete. At least, she thought it was concrete. Damn. She really missed Cypher. "Sentinel," she called, and both men turned to look at her. "I have an idea." Without a single means of communication with Tempest and Hawkeye, and no trail to be found, it felt impossible to track them. After facing the horde of thralls, Ares was sure they were facing a single entity that was creating and controlling the creatures, while also isolating Hawkeye and Tempest. If Raptor understood everything correctly, it worked similar to the Spire's psionic dampening field, except massive, which, as much as he hated to admit it, was exactly why Aegis's idea had so much potential. The way she explained it to the rest of the team was that if Hawkeye and Tempest were close enough to be within the Spire's field, they would be able to see and communicate with them. But, since they were obviously much farther away, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack to find them. They were invisible in all ways to the rest of Ares, maybe nearby, but totally isolated. So, they needed to overwhelm the interference of whatever was controlling the thralls, just long enough to get a location of the other two team members. But Spire was still new tech for Umbral. and what Sentinel was carrying was basically a second-generation prototype. The first prototype had a longer reach, but had fried Eldridge's brain when he used it at its maximum capacity. But the scientist had neurally linked himself with the device for days. None of Ares was linked to their spire, and they didn't need to be. All they needed to do was get one single, far-reaching pulse of power from it. The plan was this. They would take the power source from Aegis and Jester's wrist interfaces and wire them to the spire's power source. It should provide a surge of energy strong enough to extend the passive dampening field for miles. Raptor would try to reach Tempest or Hawkeye and record their location. As soon as the location was acquired, they would disconnect the extra power sources and hope that the spire still functioned. It was dangerous. If they short-circuited the spire device, they would be vulnerable to the same energy manipulations that were affecting the two Lost members. They'd basically be running blind. But it was nearly sunset, and they needed to get the damned thing done. So, he and Sentinel approved the plan, even if it was risky to attempt without a tech expert. All they had was Jester, and he didn't know much about the inner workings of something like Spire. But his years of explosive disarming had given him careful hands and vast arrays of information on how to carefully rewire something delicate. Raptor trusted the guy with his life, so wiring two things together should be easy enough. With Jester's help, it was relatively simple for Aegis to pop her battery out, reroute the power source, and rewire it to link with Spire. Jester connected Raptor's battery to it and went over a last safety check. The final steps rushed to catch up with daylight. Sentinel pulled the Spire device out, holding it tight against his side and looking at Raptor, Jester, and Aegis. When the link goes through, whatever is holding our two missing team members might attack the source. Raptor added, meaning us. Jester nodded, and Aegis rolled her shoulders, as she often did right before things went to complete shit. Sentinel just made a sound in his throat and snapped. We're done. Switching it on. Everyone took several steps back. They knew it would be a jolt of power when Jester plugged it in, and hoped that they'd be safe when things went down. Raptor would have likened it to an electric fence. 1 second everything was normal, and in the next, he and Jester were on the ground. Aegis had her hands braced against one of the rocks to steady herself, and Sentinel had doubled over, his teeth clenched, and a low groan tore from his throat. The spire had fallen from Sentinel's grasp before he managed to scoop it back up and hold it steady. It was emitting a pale purple glow, brighter than normal, and so blinding he had to turn his gaze to look away from it. Then things strengthened. The sensation he got from being under the spire's passive field was jolting. It blurred his consciousness, and his grip on reality was tenuous at best. This was being knocked off a goddamn bridge. But he was altered, faster and stronger than the rest, and he'd be damned if this would keep him down. As Raptor pulled himself up, it all happened at once. Jester and Sentinel's interfaces, the only two still working, lit up at the distress beacon from both missing soldiers came in. Raptor activated his comms and called out for them.
Hawkeye, Tempest, come in.
The response was garbled but instant. Tempest's voice was laced with relief, even as it cut in and out with interference.
Rapt, coming through?
Hawkeye chimed in a moment later, their voice also strained and words garbled.
Are you actually? It won't stay. Go underneath. Not enough. Stay linked. Have to.
Sentinel got onto his feet while the voice died in and out. his grip on Raptor's shoulder so hard it was close to breaking. "Hurry,"
2 seconds.
he said to Tempest and Hawkeye.
Give me what you can.
Hawkeye's voice was unintelligible, and Tempest's wasn't much better, but he got one word out of her.
Waterfall.
With a curse, Sentinel yanked the cord connecting the extra batteries to the Spire device, and the suffocating net of power dissipated in an instant. Raptor blinked a few times to clear his vision, and on the map he had pulled up on his own interface, 2 red distress beacons pulsed, the last recorded locations of his 2 teammates. Sentinel shoved the Spire back into his belt. Raptor split their current route with the location Hawkeye and Tempest's pulse originated from. To everyone's surprise, the waterfall and oasis was close, but that meant that whatever was controlling those thralls was likely close by as well.
Tempest, Hawkeye.
He called again, but this time there was no response. He tried a few more times for good measure, and the only thing that met him was static. Sentinel shook him on the shoulder and started doling out the marching orders. "Let's move. The Spire device still has a little juice, but I don't think it's going to give us nearly the range it had before. If one of us sees Tempest or Hawkeye, get your hands on them. Tie them to you. Whatever you need to do to make sure we won't lose them again if the Spire dies. Immediate and complete destruction of anything that stands in our way. We aren't going to have the luxury of formation or maneuvering. This enemy is a complete unknown, so let's just kill the damn thing and be done with it." No one argued with Sentinel. The sunset was beginning, and time was of the essence. He didn't care about extracting once it was dark, but he desperately wanted to have the other 2 Ares members in hand before nightfall. The idea of facing something like whatever was commanding the thralls without the light of the sun made him uneasy. It took a decent amount of backtracking to reach Tempest and Hawkeye. Following the signals proved difficult, and he had the fear that the Spire wasn't nearly as effective. But by the time the sky started to morph to orange and pinks, Ares had followed the beacons to the top of a rocky outcropping that circled down. There, in the center of it, was a waterfall. The oasis was a massive pool of water, and the trickling, earth-digging noises as it churned and poured under the desert rumbled beneath their feet. With a sweeping gesture, Raptor ordered them to begin moving down, weapons at the ready. He wasn't sure what was in store for them, but he wasn't leaving until he had his soldiers. Hawkeye sprinted, his heavy gear thumping against his body as he struggled to keep up with Tempest. Damn, she could move, but like him, she was running blind. They were back in the desert, but at the corners of his vision, the blackness of the liminal space was starting to creep in again. His plan had been to outrun the alien, but it quickly became apparent that it was going to be impossible. All they could do was find some kind of landmark before the unreality swallowed them again. Something that might help the rest of the team find them. The ground underneath his feet shifted from sand to stone, and in front of him Tempest came to a skidding stop. He slowed and came to stand beside her, looking down at the pool at the bottom of the cliff, and the waterfall that cascaded down into it. It was all eerily silent. They were losing their grip on the real world, and fast. Hawkeye looked over his shoulder, saw the oncoming darkness rushing up behind him, and made a split-second decision. The sniper clutched his rifle to his body with one hand, the other arm sweeping over his head as he dove. It was a Hail Mary decision, and there was a good chance he would crack his skull on the rocks in a shallow pool, but he did it anyway. He heard Tempest yell above him, right before his body cut into the water, and by some miracle, it was featureless and deep. Fighting against the weight of his gear, Hawkeye swam, swinging one arm and kicking both feet, refusing to drop his gun. When he felt the deluge of the waterfall hit him, he faintly heard the splash of Tempest hitting the water behind him. Finally, exhausted, he crawled up onto the stone shore of the small hollow behind the waterfall. Just as reality winked out, and they were back in the red purgatory. Tempest crawled up into the rocky ground beside him and collapsed on her back, breathing hard. Hawkeye looked around. It was the same as before. A black earth shot through with white veins, all in a crimson haze. But somehow, the waterfall in front of them hadn't disappeared like everything else. It was fully present, and their view was distorted by the falling water. It was enough to ground him, to remind him that they weren't really on some other world. At least, he hoped they weren't. He would pick Earth any day. Tempest rolled onto her side and propped herself onto one hand. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, both of their comms crackled to life. Raptor's voice sounded tiny and far away, but it was there. Tempest was quick to respond, scrambling onto her hands and knees to sit closer to Hawkeye. Her fingers tangled in the neck of his armor, trying to bring him closer, as though they could amplify the weak signal that way.
Raptor, we're here. Are we coming through?
He didn't answer.
Are you actually there? We still don't have any way to get to you. Listen, this thing won't stay away. Go to the cliffside a few miles from the mine. We're underneath the waterfall. Not enough signal for us to stay linked. You're going to have to follow the distress beacons.
He could barely hear his own words through the heavy static. They thought they heard Sentinel speaking, and then it was Raptor again.
2 seconds. Give me what you can. Underneath the waterfall,
Tempest repeated. But as soon as the sound left her lips, the static faded out and the connection was gone. The only sound left in the warped caves were their shaky breaths and pounding pulses. Tempest swore before rolling back to her own space. Hawkeye stayed silent, staring straight ahead and wondering if they had just sent the rest of Ares to their doom. In the distance, the alien, one of those pilots from that ship, seemed to be forming whatever new environment it was going to trap them in. He didn't understand why. At that point, they were wise to its games. But slowly, the world around them became once again familiar, and Hawkeye's stomach turned. Towering metal shelving units crusted with ice, exposed ventilation systems, and slate-gray walls. But unlike Viridian, the pilot had never been to Svalbard and was creating the facsimile of the seed vault from whatever memories it had been able to skim from the two of them. The room was nonsensical and warped, but it had gotten one detail right. The body slumped against the wall, wearing an Ares uniform. Cipher. Damn it. He heard Tempest whisper, her voice thick. The vision undulated, the alien struggling to keep it in place, but it only made Hawkeye feel sicker. His only saving grace was that the voice in his head didn't have anything to say about what was in front of them. Maybe it was in shock too. The hallucination of the seed vault wavered again, like the alien had grown weaker, and he could almost feel the frustration in the air. Ares must have been giving it hell, considering how messy this projection was compared to the last one. Hawkeye wiped his hands off on his body, even though he knew the water that dripped from his gloves hadn't really fallen in a freezing Norwegian facility. It fell at the bottom of an oasis a few miles away, and was probably crystal clear, a sharp contrast to the reality they were trapped in. Tempest remained silent at his side, her dark eyes focused on Cypher's body in the corner. Then, she spoke. What Did it mean your head was too crowded, Hawkeye? He shrugged one shoulder, knowing that she'd never leave this alone. Probably that brain-to-computer link they tested on me after. Hawkeye tore his eyes away from the image of the corpse in front of them both. After I had to take over Cypher's position. Tempest swallowed, and he noticed that her jaw was tense. She blinked, and finally moved her gaze, as though if she were to keep staring, then their fallen member might open his eyes. But no, he was still dead, all thanks to Hawkeye himself. Bullshit, she murmured. We might die here. Just tell me the truth. He didn't tell her anything. Hawkeye stayed quiet, even as the shadows started to gather once more beneath the metal shelving and along the walls. But this time, they weren't forming anything. Instead, they felt like a warning. The real creature was coming. You're a coward, his teammate breathed. If you were a real warrior, Hawkeye, you'd give it up. But you won't, right? Tempest barked a laugh. Umbral's little dog, letting them fuck with your brain, poke around in it to their heart's desire. Don't think I forgot how you almost drew on me in Aegis back at the Genesis lab. So why not do it now? Hawkeye felt fury and shame building inside of him in equal parts, but he stayed silent. Tempest was on her feet now, water dripping from her uniform, her small fists balled at her side. Because you didn't get the command to, right? Woof woof. Always the obedient little... Every man had a limit, even the most perfectly trained mercenaries. Hawkeye was on his feet, grabbing Tempest's uniform by the collar and slamming her against one of the metal racks. At first, she went right through it, the projection failing, but reality skipped, and her back hit the steel, causing the entire thing to shudder. Tempest grunted, eyes narrowed, the water droplets in her hair freezing in the impossible cold. "Shut up," he growled. "If you knew what's good for you. If you value your life, Tempest, you'll shut up." Tempest pulled her feet nearly to her chest and kicked out, catching Hawkeye in the stomach and making him stumble back. She hit like a freight train, unforgiving, and he had to struggle to catch his breath before she was on him again. Tempest moved fast, faster than almost anyone else he'd ever crossed, which is why her kick hurt so goddamn much. Hawkeye pivoted and raised his fists, blocking her next punch before charging her with his shoulder. She took the hit and rolled, but was on her feet again in the blink of an eye. "Yeah, maybe you're right." Her words were interrupted between harsh breaths. "Maybe I'll shut up, and we can end this now." There was a faint sound of the waterfall in front of them before their comms suddenly screeched an otherworldly, guttural static, and Tempest and Hawkeye stopped, stunned in their place as it sent pain through their whole beings. Then, the Spire's signature net of power surged up over their bodies, and Ares finally burst through the veil. Raptor and Sentinel were in the lead, guns drawn. Jester and Aegis came up behind them, the four quickly fanning out to cover the area around Hawkeye and Tempest. They looked disheveled and sweaty, but they were alive, and their presence shattered the illusion, erasing Svalbard and bringing the Sonoran Desert back around them. The last thing to disappear was Cypher, standing now, milky eyes wide open and watching them both before he faded into nothing. In his head, Cypher's voice whispered, "She knows." Hawkeye and Tempest hastily abandoned their scuffle and picked back up their fallen weapons, bringing them to bear just in time. The alien must have followed Ares' progress across the desert in its disorienting liminal world, because it was there, floating just on the other side of the waterfall, so much more solid than its projection from before. Their positioning was terrible. They needed to get out of the hollow behind the waterfall, or the 6 of them would be completely pinned down. Tempest and Hawkeye went in the same direction, slashing through the falling sheet, the cold water enveloping them before the desert. The rest of Ares wasted no time following after them, pressing close to the wall off the cliff so they didn't fall into the pool. Raptor raised his fist, and Ares came to a halt once they were out of the small crevice and back in the fading sun. The alien had shadowy tendrils gathered around its body, like a cape. Hawkeye swallowed hard. Whereas it had been strange before, now it was terrifying. Instead of the anger he had felt rolling off it after Viridian, this time, the being was wary and predatory. Like its projection, it was tall, elongated and skeletal, but much more solid. It drew the shadowy tendrils back into itself, growing even clearer as it did so. Its jagged body was encased in a sleek metallic suit that radiated some sort of shimmering shield. The thick, sticky blackness of its face and hands were the only real bits of it visible. And those eyes, the solid glowing slants in the side of its elongated head, the burning slits in the mask, locked straight onto him. Hawkeye felt chills run up his spine. This wasn't any projection. The alien was there, in the desert. It was corporeal, ready to meet Ares head to head. Then, its head rotated towards Raptor, and a grating, clicking sound filled the air. They heard it speak in their minds.
You feel so familiar. They used our little piece of the hive mind to fix you, didn't they?
No one answered, except for Sentinel, who closed his fist and punched it forward. Attack, full tilt offensive, kill on sight. Tempest and Aegis surged forward, the sniper close behind her. Sentinel hung back beside Jester, whose own weapon was drawn. Hawkeye had the sudden realization that maybe Ares was undermanned. This alien, it hadn't even needed a ship to follow them to Arizona. The 6 of them were taking on something that existed in separate realms, all at once. But all the doubt melted away as he fell into his practiced pattern. Hawkeye began to fire on the alien pilot, while Tempest laid down covering fire. Aegis launched a smoke grenade, and when it exploded, the alien had no warning as Tempest came leaping through it, her monomolecular blade sailing from her hand and hitting home in the thing's chest. The alien gave a bizarre shrieking sound, throwing the knife from its body. The blade skittered across the sand. The pilot flexed, gathering those shadow tendrils like weapons, using its long arms and legs to tear and sling at his teammates, who were right up in its space, hacking and shooting and screaming for blood. Raptor got in close, but the tendril shot out towards him, trying to spear through him. But as fast as the pilot moved, Raptor was quicker. Hawkeye thought of Tempest kicking the shit out of him minutes ago, and how she might match the second-in-command step for step if they ever trained together. Because right as the tendril arced over Aegis's crouched, shooting form, Raptor surged up to it with the superhuman speed and closed one gloved hand around the inky stalk of blackness, stopping the thing in mid-air, as though it was the soft, slow curve of a bat. The thing struggled, writhing like a hooked fish, and Raptor gritted his teeth before letting out an almighty yell. His free hand wrapped around his pistol, firing it until the thing in his grasp lost its momentum. Another tendril yanked Raptor away and flung the man into the pool behind him, and the pendulum had swung in Ares' direction. Ares pressed their attack. The 5 of them covered the being from almost every angle. Hawkeye worked with Sentinel, pulling his secondary weapons so Ares was attacking the alien with full bore with one pistol, 3 rifles, and Jester's shotgun, pelting it with high-powered bullets from their custom-modified armory. Meanwhile, Raptor climbed back on shore. The pilot fought back, calling thralls from the desert around them. They looked unfinished, and with a sickening lurch, Hawkeye realized what exactly they were. Biological masses of desert fauna, stitched together with the psionic power of the pilot until they were one single, mutated creature, crafted into a vague shape similar to the pilot. But unlike their extraterrestrial commander, they had no metallic suit, only flesh and rough armor made from bone. But these unfinished thralls were the last of the small army it had created. They were nearing the end of this fight. The alien was clearly struggling. They saw Raptor launch forward. Tempest followed closely on his heels with Aegis, but before Hawkeye could join Sentinel in flanking, one last tendril surged past the rest of Ares towards the commander. Hawkeye felt reality slip around them. The pilot had stabbed not at Sentinel, but at the small device on his belt. The pilot disabled their force field, and the desert began to warp, then change. And with their barrier gone, there was nothing between the being and its prize, and the pilot grasped the spire. If it couldn't have Tempest or some other body to control until it could reach Chimera again, it would apparently settle for Umbral's own psionic tech, a last-ditch attempt to level the playing field. Ares' comms were screeching again. Even Sentinel flinched, but the pain was nothing compared to the overwhelming power they felt rippling through the air. Ares couldn't fire their guns, and they couldn't even get close. Hawkeye tried running, but he couldn't fight the sudden pull. As a team, Ares felt gravity yanking them towards the pilot. Hawkeye's feet were digging deep into the sand, but not moving him out of the drag zone. Ahead, Tempest and the rest of her teammates hit the ground. Jester made a sickening, choking noise, and Aegis clutched at her helmet, but Raptor and Tempest crawled on their hands and knees. Hawkeye's vision blurred. He felt his eardrums screaming, and there, as he inched his head to look at the alien being, Hawkeye thought he saw the spire vibrating in the pilot's grasp. "Be ready to take a shot," Cypher said, deep within his gray matter. "The spire won't hold." The ghost was right. It was too much for the device. The earlier power surge, plus whatever energy the pilot was pushing through it, shattered the spire, and reality fell around them once more like a comforting cloak. It wasn't the same for the pilot, though. As the spire splintered into pieces, it gave off one last explosive swell of energy that knocked the pilot back hard. The concussive force broke the pilot's shimmering shield, and Hawkeye saw his chance. He took a knee, raising his AWM, aiming, and pulling the trigger in a movement as practiced and easy as breathing. As natural to him as the beating of his own heart. The bullet hit its mark, right at the center of the alien's chest, and his second shot took the pilot between the eyes. It screeched like razor blades on glass, shuddered, blinking, in and out of view, sinking into the water where it lay dying. Ares advanced. Hawkeye kept his rifle trained on it just in time to see the inky darkness seep out from the holes he'd put through its body, its strange face rotating to look down at where its blackness was melting back outwards. The liquid-like shadows began to leach down into the azure water, like poison. They all formed a line at the water's edge and watched it sink beneath the surface. Finally, the sun dipped below the horizon. It was over. Night was settling in, but the team was breathing hard, shaking with adrenaline. Hawkeye half expected the alien's lifeless body to bob up like driftwood, or something equally strange. But it was nowhere to be found in the deep lake. Sentinel's voice broke his reverie. "Aegis, check the two of them over. Raptor, call for extraction." The commander looked out over the lake, his form tense. "Make sure they understand the magnitude of what has happened here. Jester and I will stand guard." Hawkeye slung his rifle over his shoulder and rubbed one hand across his bare face, exhausted. Tempest passed by him on her way to Aegis, who was setting up a small medical area, and stopped. She didn't look up at the sniper, but spoke low enough so only he could hear her. "This isn't over." He laughed once, and to both of their shock, there was a single thread of humor in it. It never is."